This story contains themes of survival, mystery, and intense psychological suspense, which some listeners may find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. The cold wasn't the worst part. Not the biting wind that carved through layers of thermal gear, nor the endless stark white landscape that swallowed sound and perspective whole. It wasn't even the bone-deep isolation, the knowledge that you were hundreds of miles from anything resembling civilization, a tiny, fragile speck in an unforgiving titan of ice and rock. No, the worst part, the truly soul-chilling terror, was the absolute certainty that you were not alone, and that whatever else was out there, it wasn't just watching you, it was hunting you. David Miller had always scoffed at such notions. A seasoned woodsman, a big game hunter whose reputation preceded him from the Rockies to the Alaskan interior, he knew the wilderness like the back of his hand. He'd stared down grizzlies, outsmarted wolverines, and navigated blizzards that would send lesser men scrambling for cover. Alaska to David wasn't a place of fear. It was a sanctuary, a proving ground, a grand silent cathedral where he felt most alive. This trip, however, was different. Deep in the remote, unnamed peaks of the Wrangell-Elias Range, an area so untouched it barely registered on satellite maps, David had come seeking the ultimate challenge. A legendary Kodiak bear, rumored to be the largest ever seen, a ghost of the mountains, a true king of the wild. He'd spent weeks meticulously planning, poring over topographic maps, studying ancient settler logs and indigenous folklore for any hint of its migratory patterns. His gear was top of the line, every item chosen for its reliability and efficiency. His rifle, a custom-built .375 H&H Magnum, was an extension of his own arm. David was prepared for everything the Alaskan wilderness could throw at him, or so he thought. The first hint of trouble wasn't a growl, or a broken branch, or even an unusual track in the snow. It was far more insidious, a subtle whisper against the fortress of his confidence. It started 3 days into his trek, after he'd established his base camp near a frozen riverbed, nestled among a cluster of ancient spruce trees whose branches groaned under the weight of perpetual snow. He'd meticulously set up his tent, organized his supplies, and spent the first 2 days scouting the surrounding valleys, marking potential game trails. Every evening, he'd return to his camp, warm up a dehydrated meal, and log his observations in a waterproof journal. On the third evening, as the last sliver of sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, David noticed it. His firewood stack. He'd arranged it in a neat pyramid outside his tent flap, a habit born of efficiency and a touch of wilderness OCD. Now, a few of the smaller logs, ones he'd specifically placed on top for kindling, were subtly out of alignment. Not scattered, not disturbed by an animal, but moved. Just slightly, as if someone had picked them up, examined them, and then placed them back, albeit imperfectly. David's brow furrowed. He was alone. Utterly, completely alone. He'd flown in by bush plane, dropped off at a glacial lake over 100 miles away, and hiked in. No other human being had been within days of his current location for years, perhaps decades. He was certain of it. He attributed it to the wind, perhaps a snowmelt shift, or even his own memory playing tricks. He rearranged the logs, dismissing the fleeting unease. The next morning, the unease returned, stronger this time. He'd left a small, distinctively shaped rock on top of his food cache, a personal marker he used to confirm if anything had been tampered with. The rock was gone. Not knocked off, not buried by snow, but simply gone. He searched the immediate vicinity, his eyes scanning the pristine snow for any sign of disturbance. Nothing. The snow around the cache was unmarked, save for his own boot prints from the previous day. Yet, the rock was undeniably absent. A shiver unrelated to the sub-zero temperatures ran down his spine. This wasn't the wind. This wasn't him. This was something else. He checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded and within easy reach. He spent the day hunting, but his focus was fractured. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of frozen leaves, sent his senses screaming. He felt an undeniable prickle on the back of his neck, the primal sensation of being watched. He returned to camp just before nightfall, heart pounding with a rhythm that had nothing to do with exertion. He scanned the area with his binoculars, his hunter's eyes searching for anything out of place. A flicker of movement, a shadow that lingered too long. Nothing. The wilderness was silent, vast, and indifferent. Too silent, perhaps. The usual sounds of the wild, the distant cry of a hawk, the scurry of a snowshoe hare, the whisper of the wind through the pines seemed muted, almost non-existent. That night sleep refused to come. Every creak of the tent fabric, every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. He lay awake, rifle clutched in his hand, his eyes fixed on the tent flap, his ears straining against the oppressive silence. He told himself it was fatigue, the isolation playing tricks on his mind. He was a rational man, a man of facts and evidence. But the evidence, however subtle, was mounting. The fourth morning brought with it a chilling discovery that shattered his composure entirely. He woke up to find a perfectly formed, small pile of pebbles on his sleeping bag, right beside his head. He hadn't touched them. His tent had been zipped shut from the inside, the flaps secured. There was no way anything could have gotten in without his knowledge. And yet, there they were. Smooth, gray pebbles, completely out of place in his meticulously organized tent. It wasn't a prank. It was a deliberate, impossible act. David shot upright, scrambling out of his sleeping bag, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tore open the tent flap, scanning the desolate landscape, his mind racing. Who? How? Why? His eyes landed on the snow directly outside his tent. There, barely visible against the white expanse, were faint impressions. Not footprints, not exactly. More like indentations, a series of elongated, almost claw-like marks, circling his tent. They were too large for any known animal, too irregular for a human boot, and terrifyingly, they showed no clear entry or exit path. They simply appeared to begin and end right around his camp. His breath hitched. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't a lost hiker. This was something else entirely. Something intelligent. Something that could seemingly walk through walls. Something that was toying with him. His initial confidence, his seasoned hunter's bravado, began to crumble under the weight of the impossible. The Kodiak bear, the ultimate challenge he'd come for, now felt like a distant, irrelevant thought. A far more primal fear had taken root. He was no longer the apex predator, the master of his domain. He was being observed. He was being tested. He was being hunted. And the chilling realization solidified in his mind. Whatever was out there, whatever was leaving these impossible signs, it wasn't just lurking in the shadows. It had been inside his tent. While he slept, the air in his tent, already thin with the elevation, suddenly felt suffocating, heavy with an unseen presence. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the vast silence of the wilderness. He scanned the cramped space, his eyes darting from the rolled-up sleeping bag to his pack, to the small portable stove. Every shadow seemed to writhe, every fold in the fabric a potential hiding place for an unseen watcher. How could anything so large, so present, have entered and exited without a sound, without a trace? The zipper was still secured. The tent stakes were still firmly in the frozen ground. There were no tears in the nylon. It was as if the entity had simply phased through, or perhaps it had been there before him. A cold dread, far deeper than any fear he'd known, began to seep into his bones. This wasn't a bear, not a wolf. Animals didn't play mind games. They didn't leave cryptic messages or move objects with such deliberate, unsettling precision. This was something different, something intelligent, something malevolent. He scrambled to his feet, fumbling for his headlamp, his hands trembling so violently he nearly dropped it. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the familiar objects of his camp, but now they seemed alien, imbued with a sinister potential. He methodically swept the light across every inch of the tent floor, searching for any disturbance, any sign he might have missed. He checked the corners, ran his hand along the inside of the tent walls, even peeked under his sleeping pad. Nothing. The tent was exactly as he'd left it, pristine in its deception. But then, his gaze fell upon his backpack, slumped against the far wall. It looked normal, but something about it felt off. He remembered packing it meticulously the night before, every item in its designated spot. Now, a small dark shape protruded from the main compartment's zipper, a zipper he was certain he'd closed completely. With a surge of adrenaline that made his vision swim, Michael reached for it, his fingers brushing against something smooth, cold, and utterly out of place. He pulled it out. It was a river stone, perfectly smooth and egg-shaped, the kind he'd often seen polished by the relentless currents of glacial meltwater. But this one wasn't ordinary. Etched into its surface with what looked like a sharp, deliberate instrument was a symbol. It wasn't a letter, nor a recognized pictograph. It was a series of intersecting lines, forming a crude, jagged star, almost like a child's drawing, but with an unsettling imbalance, a twisted symmetry that spoke of something ancient and primal. And beneath the star, a single deep scratch like a claw mark bisected the stone. Michael stared at it, his mind racing, trying to make sense of this impossible artifact. Where had it come from? He hadn't picked up any such stone. And how had it gotten into his pack, zipped away without him knowing? A shiver ran down his spine. This wasn't merely a sign of presence, it was a delivery. A message. The entity wasn't just observing him, it was communicating. And the message, though indecipherable, felt profoundly threatening. He dropped the stone as if it were burning his hand, watching it clatter onto the tent floor. The sound, amplified in the silence, made him jump. He needed to get out. He needed to leave this place now. But the blizzard was still raging outside. A howling white wall that promised certain death to anyone foolish enough to venture into it. He was trapped. Trapped with the knowledge that something had been in here, right beside him while he slept, and had left this chilling calling card. Panic began to set in, a cold, creeping fog that threatened to overwhelm his seasoned composure. Michael, the experienced hunter, the wilderness expert, felt his carefully constructed world of logic and reason crumbling around him. He took deep, shuddering breaths, trying to regain control. He was a survivor. He had faced down grizzlies, navigated treacherous rapids, endured blizzards far worse than this. He could think his way out of this. First, he needed to secure his position. He grabbed his hunting rifle, a heavy-caliber bolt-action designed for large game, and checked the chamber. It was loaded. He held it tightly, the cold steel a small comfort against the encroaching terror. Then he moved to the tent entrance, peering through the small, frosted window. The world outside was a maelstrom of white, visibility barely a few feet. The wind shrieked, tearing at the tent fabric, making it flap like a wounded bird. He couldn't leave. Not yet. He needed to understand. What was this thing? A rogue trapper playing a cruel joke? A deranged hermit? But the tracks, the impossible tracks. And the stone. No human could move like that, or leave such an unsettling, deliberate token without detection. His mind, desperate for a rational explanation, began to conjure up old Alaskan legends, tales told around campfires of spirits of the land, of shapeshifters, of ancient, forgotten things that guarded the desolate peaks. He scoffed internally. He was a man of science, a man of logic. But the stone lying innocently on his tent floor defied all logic. His gaze returned to it, drawn by a morbid curiosity. He picked it up again, turning it over in his fingers. The symbol was deep, deliberate. It felt old. As he examined it, he noticed something else, something he had missed in his initial panic. Along the edge of the stone, almost invisible against the dark surface, was a faint reddish-brown smear. He brought it closer to the meager light from his headlamp. It was dried, and it looked suspiciously like blood. A jolt went through him. Whose blood? What did it mean? Was it a warning? A trophy? His stomach churned. The implications were horrifying. This wasn't just a game. It was deadly serious. He carefully placed the stone inside a small, sealed plastic bag, not wanting to touch it directly anymore, and tucked it deep into an inner pocket of his pack. He would analyze it later if he lived to see later. The immediate priority was defense. He couldn't just sit here waiting to be toyed with. He needed to make his tent a fortress, however flimsy. He dragged his heavy pack and supplies to block the tent entrance, creating a makeshift barricade. He positioned himself with his back against the furthest wall, rifle across his lap, facing the entrance. He wouldn't sleep. He couldn't. Not with the knowledge that it had been here. Hours crawled by, each minute an eternity. The blizzard outside showed no signs of abating, its relentless assault a constant reminder of his isolation. Every gust of wind, every creak of the tent poles, sent a fresh wave of terror through him. His eyes, burning from lack of sleep, scanned the interior, then darted to the small window, trying to pierce the white veil outside. He imagined eyes watching him from the swirling snow, a silent, predatory gaze. He tried to distract himself, to focus on practicalities. He checked his satellite phone. No signal. He tried again, angling the antenna towards the sky, praying for a break in the storm, a momentary crack in the atmospheric interference. Nothing. The vast, unforgiving wilderness had swallowed him whole, cutting him off from the world. He was truly alone. A new realization dawned on him, chilling him to the core. The stone, the tracks, the precise, almost surgical way his camp had been tampered with, it wasn't just about terror. It was about observation, study. The entity was learning his habits, his vulnerabilities. It was testing him, yes, but also preparing for something. The thought made his blood run cold. It wasn't just a random encounter. It was a deliberate, calculated hunt. And he was the prey. He remembered the unsettling feeling from the previous night, the prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the inexplicable urge to turn around. He had dismissed it as exhaustion, as the usual paranoia of deep wilderness. But now it all made sense. It had been there, watching him, long before it made its presence known. It had been observing him from the moment he set foot in this valley, maybe even earlier. The thought of being watched, of being an unwitting subject in some twisted experiment, was almost worse than the fear of a direct attack. It stripped him of his agency, of his control. He was a specimen trapped in a glass cage, while something unknown peered in, dissecting his reactions, enjoying his growing dread. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble, the grime, the exhaustion etched into his features. He needed to think clearly. He needed a plan. If he couldn't leave, he had to defend. But how do you defend against something you can't see? Something that moves through walls, that leaves impossible signs. He decided to focus on what he did know. The tracks were large, bipedal, and left an unusual impression. The stone was carved, ancient-looking, and had dried blood on it. It was intelligent. It was strong. And it was playing with him. This wasn't a territorial dispute. This was something else entirely. He remembered the local legends his guide, an old Athabascan man named Thomas, had told him years ago when he first ventured into this region. Tales of shadow walkers or mountain giants that moved unseen through the forests, leaving behind only strange signs or sudden, unexplained disappearances. He had always dismissed them as quaint folklore, stories to scare tourists. But now, alone in the heart of the storm, with an impossible stone in his pack, those legends didn't seem so quaint anymore. A sudden sharp crack from outside the tent made him jump, nearly dropping his rifle. He froze, listening intently. It wasn't the wind. It was a distinct sound, like wood snapping under immense pressure. He strained his ears, his breath held tight in his chest. Then another crack, closer this time, followed by a low guttural scrape, as if something heavy was being dragged across the frozen ground. It was moving around his tent. Slowly, deliberately. He pressed himself tighter against the tent wall, rifle raised, safety off. His finger hovered over the trigger. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. The sound of dragging stopped directly outside his tent door. Then silence. A profound, terrifying silence, broken only by the incessant shriek of the blizzard. He waited, muscles tensed, every nerve ending screaming. What was it doing? What was it leaving for him now? The anticipation was a physical pain, a tightening vice around his chest. He knew with a terrifying certainty that whatever was out there, it wasn't going to just leave him alone. It was just getting started. He knew with a terrifying certainty that whatever was out there, it wasn't going to just leave him alone. It was just getting started. The air outside his cabin was ablaze, sharp and unforgiving. But the cold that truly pierced Michael was the one that had settled in his bones. He stood at the threshold, the warmth of the wood stove a forgotten comfort against the gnawing dread. His breath plumed in the frigid air as he forced himself to take a step, then another, towards the dark shape on his porch. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to turn back, to slam the door and pretend it wasn't real, but the curiosity, morbid and irresistible, pulled him forward. The moon, a sliver of ice in the inky sky, cast just enough light to illuminate the disturbing tableau. It was a snowshoe hare, recent victim of some predator, but not just any predator. The creature lay perfectly still, its pristine white fur a stark contrast to the crimson stain on the weathered wood of his porch. But it wasn't the blood that made Michael's stomach lurch. It was the meticulous way the fur had been peeled back from the hare's skull, revealing the raw, glistening muscle and bone beneath. And its eyes, they were gone, scooped out with surgical precision, leaving hollow, accusing sockets that seemed to stare into the depths of Michael's soul. This wasn't an animal kill. This was a statement, a grotesque, artful display of malice. Michael felt a wave of nausea, cold and acidic, rise in his throat. He backed away slowly, his eyes sweeping the perimeter, the shadows now alive with unseen horrors. He spun on his heel, fumbling with the latch, and burst back into the cabin, slamming the door shut with a resounding thud that echoed in the sudden, oppressive silence. He leaned against the heavy timber, chest heaving, the scent of pine and wood smoke now tainted with the phantom smell of fresh blood and something else, something metallic and acrid like fear. His mind raced, a frantic hamster on a wheel. This thing, whatever it was intelligent. It was deliberate. It was playing with him, a cat with a mouse, and the game was getting increasingly personal. He moved with a frantic urgency, barricading the door with a heavy wooden beam, then checking the latches on every window, double-checking, triple-checking, as if a flimsy pane of glass could hold back the malevolence lurking outside. The cabin, once his sanctuary, now felt like a flimsy cage, a transparent barrier between him and an unimaginable terror. "Okay, Michael. Think," he muttered to himself, his voice a hoarse whisper in the stillness. "You need help. You need to get out." He grabbed his satellite phone from its charging cradle. The small digital screen remained stubbornly blank. He pressed the power button again, then again, his thumb growing numb. Nothing. No battery. He charged it just yesterday meticulously. He plugged it into the wall outlet, but the charging indicator light failed to illuminate. A cold dread seeped into him. He kept his electronics charged. He always kept his electronics charged. He moved to his shortwave radio, his last resort for communication. He flicked it on, the familiar hum, a momentary comfort. He tuned through the emergency frequencies, then the local channels, then the general distress bands. All he got was static, a relentless hiss that mocked his desperation. No faint voices, no crackling signals, just the empty white noise of an utterly isolated wilderness. He was cut off. Completely. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He wasn't just being hunted. He was being isolated. This thing, whatever it was, had thought this through. It had systematically severed his lifelines, leaving him stranded, alone, and utterly vulnerable. Paranoia, a cold, creeping vine, began to twist around his thoughts. Every creak of the cabin, every whisper of wind against the eaves, became a potential threat. Had it been watching him all this time? Had it been inside? The thought sent a shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the Alaskan cold. He walked through the cabin, his eyes darting, searching for anything out of place. A shifted book, a misplaced tool, anything to confirm his growing suspicion. But everything seemed exactly as he'd left it. Too perfect. He remembered his confidence, his almost arrogant certainty that he was master of this domain. He was Michael, the seasoned tracker, the unshakable hunter, the man who knew every trick the wilderness could throw at him. How quickly that facade had crumbled. Now he was just Michael, a terrified man trapped in a wooden box, waiting for the unknown to make its next move. He was no longer the apex predator. He was prey. He couldn't stay here. The cabin, once a symbol of his self-sufficiency, was now a coffin. He had to move. He had to get out. He would hike. It was a 3-day trek to the nearest ranger station, a grueling journey through unforgiving terrain, but it was his only option. He started gathering his gear, his movements stiff and deliberate. His heavy-duty pack, his warmest layers, dried rations, a first aid kit, his GPS unit, though without satellite signal it might be useless. And his rifle. He gripped it, the cold steel a small comfort. At least he had that. As he was strapping his rifle to the outside of his pack, his fingers brushed against the stock. He paused. There was a faint scratch, almost imperceptible, just above the trigger guard. He ran his thumb over it. It wasn't deep, barely a mark, but it wasn't there before. He was meticulous with his gear. He knew every blemish, every imperfection on his rifle. This was new. And then he saw something else. On the worn leather strap of his compass, a small, intricate knot. Not one of his knots. He always tied a simple, practical overhand knot. This was a complex figure eight, meticulously done. A cold, undeniable certainty washed over him. It had been inside. While he was sleeping, while he was out hunting, it had been here in his cabin, moving through his things, leaving its calling card. His sanctuary had been violated, his privacy utterly destroyed. The thought was more terrifying than any direct threat. It knew him. It had been observing him, studying him, learning his habits, his vulnerabilities. Panic, raw and visceral, seized him. He had to get out, he had to get out now. He threw the pack over his shoulders, grabbed his spare axe, and moved towards the door. He unbarred the heavy beam, his hands trembling. He paused, one last deep breath, steeling himself for whatever waited beyond the threshold. He pushed the door open, the frigid air rushing in, carrying with it the scent of pine and ice. The moon was higher now, casting long, stark shadows across the snow-covered clearing. He took a step out, then another. His eyes scanned the familiar path leading away from his cabin, the path he had cleared countless times. But something was wrong. Blocking his way, directly across the narrow trail, was a crude barrier of felled saplings, expertly interwoven, forming an impassable wall. It wasn't just a pile of logs. It was a deliberate, woven barricade, strong and sturdy, clearly designed to impede passage. And on the central sapling, hanging by a thin strand of sinew, was another offering. This one was smaller, a field mouse, its tiny body meticulously skinned, its internal organs carefully removed and arranged in a macabre spiral on a flat stone beneath it. And around this gruesome display, carved into the snow-covered bark of the saplings, were symbols. Jagged, angular lines resembling distorted human figures, reaching out with elongated limbs, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Michael stared, his breath catching in his throat. This wasn't just a warning anymore. It was a declaration. It knew he was trying to leave. It had anticipated his move. It wasn't just hunting him. It was hurting him. The hunter had become the hunted, and the game had just begun. He was trapped. He was trapped. The words echoed in the frigid air, a chilling mantra of his new reality. David stood there, numb, staring at the ravaged outboard motor. The propeller was bent into a grotesque metal flower, the engine casing smashed, wires ripped out like sinews. It hadn't just been disabled, it had been annihilated. This wasn't the work of a bear swatting at an annoyance. This was deliberate, precise, and utterly terrifying. Whatever it was, it possessed a level of intelligence and malice that defied anything he had ever encountered in the wild. He felt a cold dread seep into his bones, colder than the Alaskan wind. His last lifeline, his only hope of escape, was gone. The river, once a path to freedom, had become an impassable barrier, patrolled by an unseen, intelligent predator. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, snaked down his spine. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He wasn't just being hunted, he was being played. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a calculated game, and David was the unwitting pawn. His mind raced, a frantic scramble for options that weren't there. He was miles from any other human settlement, deep in a wilderness that had suddenly turned hostile. His satellite phone was back at the cabin, and even if he could reach it, the battery was likely long dead from the cold, or worse, it had gotten to it. The rifle, his only real defense, felt pitifully inadequate against an adversary that could move unseen, anticipate his every move, and disable his escape with such chilling precision. The sun was beginning its slow, agonizing descent, painting the snow-covered peaks in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful yet deceptive backdrop to his growing terror. Darkness was coming, and with it, a fresh wave of vulnerability. The thought of spending another night out here, exposed and defenseless, was unbearable. He had to get back to the cabin. It was a flimsy hope, a sanctuary that felt increasingly like a cage, but it was his only option. At least there he had walls of fire, and the small comfort of knowing he wasn't entirely exposed to the elements. He turned from the mangled boat, his boots crunching on the pristine snow, each step heavy with despair and a growing sense of urgency. The air was sharp, biting at his exposed skin, and he pulled his beanie lower, tightening his scarf. He felt every muscle in his body scream with exhaustion, but adrenaline, a bitter, cold surge, propelled him forward. He had to move, and quickly. As he trekked back towards the cabin, the forest seemed to close in around him. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves under the snow, every shadow cast by the setting sun seemed to hold a threat. He kept his head on a swivel, his eyes scanning the tree line, the dense underbrush, the very air itself. He knew it was out there, watching, waiting, playing its cruel game. The silence of the wilderness, once a source of peace, was now pregnant with menace. It was the silence of a predator stalking its prey, the quiet before the strike. His rifle, usually slung comfortably across his back, was now clutched tightly in his gloved hands, its cold metal a small, fragile comfort. He checked the chamber, the heavy thud of the bolt echoing in the stillness. He had a few rounds left, but against an enemy so cunning, so elusive, how many would be enough? Could he even get a shot off before it struck? The journey back felt impossibly long. The snow, once a pristine blanket, now seemed to conspire against him, each step a struggle. His legs ached, his lungs burned with the cold air, but he pushed on, driven by the primal urge to survive. He imagined it paralleling his path, a dark shadow flitting through the trees, a silent observer enjoying his torment. The thought made his skin crawl. He thought of his wife, Emily, back in their cozy home, probably wondering if he'd caught anything good, blissfully unaware of the nightmare engulfing him. A pang of guilt, sharp and sudden, pierced through him. He had promised her he'd be safe, that this was just a simple hunting trip. Now he wasn't even sure he'd make it back alive. The thought fueled his desperation, hardening his resolve. He wouldn't give up. Not now, not ever. As he finally neared the clearing where his cabin stood, a new wave of apprehension washed over him. Was it safe? Or had it been there in his absence? The cabin, a small wooden structure nestled amidst the towering pines, looked eerily silent, almost abandoned. No smoke curled from the chimney, a detail he hadn't noticed before, but which now screamed at him. He had left a small fire going, just embers to keep the chill at bay. Had it gone out? Or had something else happened? He approached cautiously, every sense on high alert. The last vestiges of daylight were fading fast, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and swayed with the gentle breeze. He stopped at the edge of the tree line, peering through the gloom at the cabin. The windows, usually reflecting the sky, were dark, like vacant eyes. He circled the cabin slowly, his rifle raised, his finger hovering near the trigger. No tracks in the fresh snow around the perimeter, which was a relief but also unsettling. It was too smart for that, too careful. He reached the front door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He fumbled for the latch, his gloved hands clumsy with cold and fear. The door creaked open, revealing a cavern of shadows within. He stepped inside, the familiar scent of pine and old wood doing little to soothe his frayed nerves. The cabin was freezing, much colder than he had left it. The small fire he'd meticulously set had indeed gone out, leaving only a pile of cold ash in the hearth. He moved quickly, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, sweeping across the small living area. The cramped kitchen, the even smaller bedroom. Everything seemed to be in its place, untouched. No signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no obvious damage. It was almost too quiet, too normal. He found his satellite phone on the small wooden table beside his cot. He snatched it up, his breath held tight in his chest, and pressed the power button. Nothing. The screen remained stubbornly black. He tried again, then again, a desperate thrumming in his chest. Dead. Completely, utterly dead. He cursed under his breath, a raw, guttural sound of frustration and despair. His last link to the outside world severed. He slumped onto the cot, the cold seeping into his weary bones. He was truly alone now, cut off, isolated in the heart of this indifferent wilderness, with an intelligent, unseen predator stalking his every move. The hunter had become the hunted, and the game was far from over. He was locked in, and the walls felt like they were slowly, inexorably closing in. He had to think, to plan, to find a way out of this nightmare. But as the last sliver of daylight vanished beyond the horizon, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness, all he could feel was the crushing weight of his isolation and the chilling certainty that it was still out there, waiting for the night to truly begin. The last sliver of daylight vanished beyond the horizon, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. All he could feel was the crushing weight of his isolation and the chilling certainty that it was still out there, waiting for the night to truly begin. Michael stood frozen, his breath catching in his throat, the sudden, profound blackness a physical blow. He reached out a hand blindly, as if to ward off the encroaching void, but there was nothing to grasp, only the cold, empty air. The familiar contours of the cabin, memorized over weeks, were now alien, treacherous. Every creak of the old timbers, every distant howl of the wind, became a monstrous whisper in the suffocating silence. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat demanding attention, demanding action. He needed light. Desperately. He fumbled in the direction of the small table where he usually kept his oil lamp. His fingers, numb with cold and fear, brushed against the rough wood, then knocked over something metallic that clattered loudly. the sound echoing like a gunshot in the confined space. He froze again, straining his ears, convinced that the noise had been heard, that it was now aware of his exact position. A wave of nausea washed over him. He could almost feel eyes on him, piercing the darkness, dissecting his terror. Finally, his hand closed around the cool, smooth glass of the lamp. A flicker of hope ignited in his chest. He knew where the matches were, or at least where they should be. He moved slowly, painstakingly, one foot dragging after the other, his arms outstretched like a sleepwalker. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, each sound a betrayal. He reached the small shelf above the stove, his fingers scrabbling amongst the dried herbs and old tins. Nothing. Panic flared, hot and sharp. Had he moved them? Had he used the last one? Then his fingertips grazed a small, rough box. Matches. Thank heavens. With trembling hands he struck one. The tiny flare of light, fragile and defiant, pushed back the oppressive blackness, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and mock him. He quickly lit the lamp, and a warm golden glow spread through the cabin, chasing away the deepest shadows, but creating new, menacing ones in the corners. The relief was immense, a balm to his frayed nerves, but it was fleeting. The light, while comforting, also made him a target. It was a beacon in the wilderness, broadcasting his presence. He moved to the small, grimy window, peering out into the inky blackness. The lamp's reflection shimmered on the glass, a ghostly mirror of his own anxious face. Beyond it, the forest was a solid, impenetrable wall of shadows. He saw nothing, heard nothing but the wind, yet the feeling of being watched intensified. It was a primal certainty, a cold dread that settled deep in his bones. He began to methodically check the cabin's defenses. The front door, already barred, felt flimsy. He dragged a heavy wooden crate from the corner, grunting with effort, and wedged it against the door, then added a stack of firewood. The windows were next. He'd already boarded up the largest one, but the smaller ones, high up near the roof, were still vulnerable. Climbing onto a chair, he hammered old blankets and spare pieces of canvas over them, creating a suffocating, lightless interior that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a tomb. As he worked, a low, guttural shriek tore through the night, closer this time, much closer than before. It wasn't the howl of a wolf, nor the cry of a mountain lion. It was something else, something ancient and deeply unsettling, a sound that spoke of malicious intent. Michael froze, the hammer clutched in his hand, his eyes wide, darting around the cabin. He gripped the old hunting rifle he'd leaned against the wall earlier, the cold metal a small comfort against the growing terror. He stood by the door, rifle raised, listening. The shriek wasn't repeated, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. It felt expectant, pregnant with unseen horrors. He imagined it circling the cabin, testing his defenses, a patient predator toying with its prey. Sweat trickled down his back despite the cold. His mind raced, replaying every strange event since the disappearance of his hunting partner, David. The mutilated deer, the bizarre symbols, the feeling of being pursued. It all led to this moment, this dark, isolated cabin, and the unknown terror lurking outside. Hours crawled by, each minute an eternity. Michael didn't dare sit, didn't dare relax. He paced the small cabin, a caged animal, his rifle always at the ready. His eyes constantly scanned the walls, the ceiling, the floor, half expecting it to materialize from the shadows. The oil lamp flickered, its flame slowly diminishing, a stark reminder of his dwindling resources. What would happen when the light finally died? He decided to ration the oil. With a heavy heart, he turned the wick down, plunging the cabin back into a deeper gloom. The shadows lengthened, dancing with every subtle movement of air. He could barely distinguish shapes now, relying more on his other senses. And then he heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from the back wall. Not outside now, but inside. Michael's blood ran cold. He spun around, rifle aimed at the source of the noise. The sound was subtle, like claws dragging lightly across wood. Then a soft, rhythmic scratching, almost like something trying to dig its way in. But it was coming from within the cabin. He slowly, cautiously moved towards the back wall, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, emanating from behind the old built-in pantry. He reached the pantry door, his hand shaking as he pushed it open. The space inside was small, cluttered with forgotten supplies, dusty jars, and old tools. The scratching stopped abruptly as he opened the door, replaced by an eerie silence. Michael held his breath, listening intently. Nothing. He slowly moved his lamp around, illuminating the cramped space. Cobwebs draped like ghostly curtains. Dust motes danced in the light. Nothing seemed out of place. He was about to dismiss it as his imagination, a trick of the mind, when his gaze fell upon something nestled in a dark corner, half hidden behind a stack of old blankets. It was a small, crudely carved wooden figurine. No, not carved. It looked like it had been gnawed into shape, fashioned from a piece of bone or antler, with sharp, jagged edges. It resembled a grotesque, squatting creature, its head disproportionately large, with two empty sockets for eyes and a wide, gaping maw. It was unsettling, horrifying in its primitive artistry, and it was covered in dried, dark stains that looked suspiciously like blood. Michael's stomach lurched. He knew this wasn't his. He had never seen it before. David hadn't owned anything like this. Where had it come from? And why was it hidden here, deep within the pantry? He reached out a hesitant hand, his fingers trembling, and picked up the figurine. It felt cold, oddly heavy, and radiating an almost palpable malevolence. As he held it, he noticed something else. Etched into its base, barely visible, were the same strange symbols he had seen carved into the tree, the same symbols that had been near the mutilated deer. And then, as he turned it over in his hand, a small, almost imperceptible detail caught his eye. A tiny dried fleck, barely larger than a speck of dust, was stuck to one of the creature's jagged teeth. He brought it closer to the lamp, squinting. It looked like human hair. Dark, coarse, and unmistakably human. A jolt of pure terror ripped through him. This wasn't just a threat from outside. This was something that had been inside the cabin, perhaps for a long time. It had been watching him, waiting, leaving this gruesome little token. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The scraping he heard wasn't it trying to get in. It was it trying to get out, or perhaps it was simply moving around, a silent, unseen occupant. He dropped the figurine as if it had burned him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cabin, his supposed sanctuary, was compromised. It had been breached. He wasn't just being hunted in the Alaskan wild. He was being hunted within his own walls. The terrifying implication settled over him like a shroud. If it had been inside, what else had it done? What else had it left behind? And where was it now? The oil lamp sputtered, the flame shrinking, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and reach for him. The darkness was closing in, and Michael, alone and trapped, knew with a profound certainty that the night was far from over. The oil lamp sputtered one last, defiant gasp, then plunged the tiny cabin into an oppressive, absolute darkness. Michael instinctively flinched, his eyes wide and useless in the sudden void. The last tendrils of light seemed to be swallowed whole by the shadows that had just moments before been merely distorted, but now felt like physical entities pressing in on him, cold and suffocating. The only illumination came from the faintest, ghostly glow of the dying embers in the wood stove, a meager, flickering pulse that did little to dispel the gloom and only intensified the feeling of utter isolation. He stood frozen for a beat, his breath ragged in his throat, listening. The storm outside seemed to roar with renewed ferocity, as if emboldened by the cabin's surrender to the darkness. Wind shrieked through the gaps in the logs, rattling the single, boarded-up window with violent intent. Snow lashed against the walls, sounding like 1,000 tiny claws scraping simultaneously. But beneath the cacophony of the tempest, Michael strained to hear something else, something more sinister, something that had been lurking just beyond the edge of his perception. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the silence of his terror. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers clumsy and trembling, desperate for even the weak beam of its flashlight. The screen flickered to life, a pale, almost pathetic beacon in the overwhelming black. He swept the beam around the small space, the light dancing over the rough-hewn walls, the overturned chair, the scattered contents of his pack. Each shadow it dispelled seemed to instantly reform behind it, deeper and more threatening. He had to move. He couldn't just stand there, a helpless target. The rifle was still propped against the wall near the door, a cold comfort. He grabbed it, the familiar weight of the firearm a small anchor in the storm of his fear. But what good was it in this darkness? What if it was already inside? His mind raced, replaying every creak, every rustle, every imagined movement since the lamp went out. He backed slowly towards the far wall, Pressing himself against the cold logs, rifle held ready. His eyes darted around, the phone's beam cutting through the darkness, searching for any sign, any shape that didn't belong. The cabin felt smaller, the air thicker, heavy with an unseen presence. He could almost feel eyes on him, tracking his every move, enjoying his terror. A new sound cut through the storm's wail, distinct and chilling. A low, guttural growl, not from the wind, not from an animal, but from something far more ancient and predatory. It seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the cabin itself, reverberating through the floorboards up into his bones. It was close. Too close. Michael swung the rifle towards the sound, his finger hovering over the trigger. "Who's there?" he rasped, his voice barely a whisper against the storm's fury. The growl intensified, a rumbling vibration that seemed to shake the very ground he stood on. Then a heavy thud against the far wall, a sound that made the entire cabin shudder. It was as if something immense had slammed into the exterior, testing its strength. He stumbled forward, his flashlight beam fixed on the impact point. The wall appeared intact, but a fresh splintering sound followed, a slow, deliberate tearing of wood, as if something was digging its way in. Panic flared hot and sharp in his chest. He had to reinforce the cabin. He had to. He started pushing the heavy wooden table towards the door, grunting with effort. His muscles screamed in protest, but adrenaline surged through him, lending him a desperate strength. He dragged a sturdy old chest from the corner, adding it to the barricade. The thudding and splintering outside continued, relentless, methodical. It wasn't trying to break in with brute force. It was working at it, like a craftsman dismantling a structure. As he struggled with the chest, his foot snagged on something loose on the floor. He stumbled, catching himself before he fell, and his flashlight beam swept down, revealing a loose floorboard. It wasn't just loose, it was raised as if recently disturbed. Curiosity, a dangerous companion in such circumstances, tugged at him. He knelt down, prying at the board with the butt of his rifle. With a groan of old wood, it lifted, revealing a shallow cavity beneath. Inside, nestled amongst dust and cobwebs, was a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth with age and handling. Next to it lay a small tarnished silver locket. Michael hesitated, the growling outside a constant, terrifying reminder of his predicament. But the journal, it felt important, a whisper from the past, perhaps a clue. He snatched up the journal, the leather cold and dry against his fingers. He pulled the locket free as well, tucking it into his pocket. He couldn't read the journal in the pitch black, but his phone's light was too precious to waste. He needed a more sustainable light source. His eyes scanned the cabin, and he remembered the small box of emergency matches he'd seen earlier, near the stove. He carefully moved towards the stove, his back pressed against the wall, rifle still clutched in one hand, the journal in the other. He found the matches, struck one, and with a small hopeful flare, lit the last stub of a candle he found on a shelf. The candle's flame was tiny, fragile, but it cast a soft, unwavering glow, a tiny island of light in the vast ocean of darkness. He settled himself on the floor, back against the wall, the journal open in his lap, the rifle across his knees. The first pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting dated years ago. The name Thomas Miller was scrawled on the inside cover. Thomas, the prospector who had owned this cabin, the one who had disappeared without a trace. Michael's heart pounded as he began to read. October 12th. The anomaly continues. Tracks around the perimeter again, far too large for any known predator. And the silence. The animals have gone quiet. Even the squirrels, the ravens. It's unsettling. Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan cold. He remembered the eerie stillness of the forest when he first arrived. October 18th. Heard it last night. A sound like metal scraping against stone, then a low guttural moan. It wasn't a bear. No bear moves like that. I felt watched. Always watched. The growl outside intensified, closer now, accompanied by a new sound, a heavy, dragging scrape along the outer wall, directly above where Michael sat. He flinched, his eyes darting to the wall, then back to the journal. October 25th. It's intelligent. It's been observing my routines. It knows when I sleep. It knows when I leave. It leaves offerings. Dead animals meticulously arranged near my traps. Mocking me. Michael's blood ran cold. The deer head, the perfect circle of traps. It wasn't random. It was a message. November 3rd. I saw it. Through the trees, a silhouette against the moon. Tall. Gaunt. Not quite human, not quite animal. Its eyes, they reflected no light, only swallowed it. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, a silent dancer of death. I fired my rifle. Didn't flinch. Just stared. Then vanished. He remembered the feeling of being watched, that prickling sensation on his neck. He remembered the ranger's body, the impossible wounds. November 10th. Spoke. Not words, not exactly. It mimicked Sarah's voice. My wife. Called my name. Thomas. Clear as day from the tree line. Plays with you. It wants to break you before it takes you. Michael gasped, a strangled sound. Mimicry. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through him. Could it have mimicked the ranger's distress call? Could it have lured him here? Outside, a piercing shriek rent the air. A sound so utterly devoid of humanity, yet so filled with malice that it froze Michael's blood. It was followed by a sickening crack, and the entire cabin shuddered violently. Dust rained down from the ceiling. A section of the wall near the window groaned, a deep tearing sound, as if the very logs were being ripped apart. He tore his eyes from the journal, his flashlight beam frantically sweeping towards the source of the noise. Through a new jagged crack in the timber, he saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. A glimpse of something dark, impossibly long and sinuous, like a skeletal limb tearing at the wood. He looked back at the journal, his breathing shallow and rapid. He had to read faster. There had to be an answer, a way out. November 15th. The traps are useless. Played with them. It wants me to know it's coming. It's not just an animal. It's a shadow given form. An ancient terror. Preys on fear. Feeds on despair. The cabin groaned again, a louder, more desperate sound this time. The crack in the wall widened, a sliver of the raging storm outside now visible, a swirling vortex of white. November 18th. It's here. At the door. It knows I'm awake. It knows I'm afraid. It's not just hunting. It's savoring the moment. It wants me to understand. It wants me to know there's no escape. The old legends call it the starved shadow. It's been here for centuries, waiting for the unwary. And it's coming for me now. It's coming for my light. The last words were scrawled, desperate, almost illegible. Then a final horrifying entry, a single word. Gone. Just as Michael finished reading, a section of the wall near the door splintered inward with a deafening crash, showering the cabin with shards of wood and a blast of icy wind. The candle flame flickered wildly, threatening to extinguish, casting grotesque, dancing shadows. And through the gaping hole, silhouetted against the swirling snow and the faint, ghostly glow of the Alaskan night, Michael saw it. It was impossibly tall, unnaturally gaunt, its limbs long and jointed in ways that defied anatomy. Its head was small, almost featureless, but two pinpricks of light, red and malevolent, burned deep within where eyes should have been. It stood motionless for a terrifying moment, observing him before slowly, deliberately, it began to step inside. The starved shadow had found its way in. The creature stepped inside. Michael's mind screamed. Every survival instinct he possessed flared into a blinding, deafening alarm. The cabin, his sanctuary, was now a tomb. His hands, though trembling violently, instinctively snapped the rifle to his shoulder. He aimed for the center of its emaciated chest, where a heart should have been, and squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked, deafening in the enclosed space. A desperate roar against the howling storm outside. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, but he barely registered it. His eyes were locked on the creature. A small dark hole appeared in the tattered fabric of its chest, a puff of frozen air escaping from the wound. But there was no blood, no injury, no flinch. The red pinpricks of its eyes merely intensified, burning brighter, hotter, with a chilling, knowing amusement. Michael fired again and again, emptying the magazine in a frantic, wild volley. Each shot ripped through the creature's form, leaving holes that seemed to mend themselves even as he watched, closing like dark fissures in a surface of deepest shadow. It wasn't flesh and bone. It was something else, something that defied physics, defied life itself. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, paralyzing him for a precious second. This wasn't an animal. This was the starved shadow. It was real. The creature took another slow, deliberate step, its head tilting almost imperceptibly, as if savoring the terror emanating from him. A low guttural sound like dry leaves skittering across ice emanated from its throat. It wasn't a growl, it was a hungry whisper, a promise of oblivion. The air around it grew impossibly cold, a bone-chilling frost that seemed to seep into Michael's very marrow, stealing his breath, numbing his limbs. He could feel his body temperature plummeting, his muscles stiffening. He dropped the now useless rifle, the clatter on the floor swallowed by the unnatural silence that had fallen over the cabin, muffling even the storm. His mind screamed at him to move, to run, but his legs felt like lead. The creature was closer now, its gaunt frame filling the doorway, its presence suffocating. He could feel its hunger, a bottomless void that was reaching out for him, not just for his flesh, but for his warmth, his life, his very soul. With a primal surge of adrenaline, Michael broke free from the paralyzing fear. He stumbled backward, knocking over a small table laden with supplies, sending cans and boxes scattering across the floor. The creature didn't rush him. It moved with a terrifying, unhurried grace, its red eyes never leaving his face. It was playing with him, a cat with a mouse, prolonging the inevitable. He scrambled towards the back door, fumbling with the heavy deadbolt with numb fingers. The wood felt icy under his touch. His breath hitched in his throat, ragged gasps tearing at his lungs. The creature was behind him. He could feel its chilling presence, the air growing colder, the whispers louder, a frantic buzzing in his ears. He could hear the crackle of frost forming on the inside of the window panes. Finally, the bolt scraped open. He yanked the door inward, throwing his weight against it, and burst out into the raging blizzard. The wind immediately tore at him, stinging his eyes with icy shards of snow. The world outside was a maelstrom of white, visibility barely a few feet. It was madness to go out there, but it was his only chance. He plunged into the knee-deep snow, stumbling blindly away from the cabin. The image of the creature's red eyes burned into his retina. He could hear it behind him, the impossible sound of its footsteps, light and swift, barely disturbing the snow, yet undeniably present. It was following him. Panic, raw and unadulterated, seized him. He pushed himself harder, his lungs burning, his muscles screaming in protest. He had no direction, no plan, just a desperate urge to put as much distance as possible between himself and the thing that hunted him. The cold was brutal, a relentless assault that threatened to shut down his body. He could feel his extremities growing numb, his fingers and toes losing sensation. Hypothermia, he knew, was a very real and immediate danger, but it was a slower, less terrifying death than what pursued him. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing face first into a drift of soft, deep snow. For a moment, he lay there, gasping, the snow cold against his face, a momentary reprieve from the biting wind. Then the cold intensified. The air above him shimmered, and those two malevolent red pinpricks appeared, hovering just beyond his reach. It had caught up. A wave of profound exhaustion washed over him, a bone-deep weariness that wasn't just physical. It felt like his very will to live was being siphoned away, slowly, inexorably. He could feel his body growing heavy, his eyelids drooping. The whispers around him grew clearer, coalescing into a single terrifying thought in his mind. Asterisk, give up. It will be easier. Asterisk. He shook his head violently, fighting against the encroaching lethargy. He couldn't give up. Not like this. He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees, his arms trembling from the effort. He scanned the swirling white chaos around him, desperate for anything, any sign, any hope. Through the curtain of snow, a faint, almost imperceptible outline caught his eye. It was a structure, half buried in drifts, looking like a forgotten ghost against the storm. David's old trapper's cabin. The one he'd mentioned, the one even further out, supposedly abandoned decades ago. A flicker of memory, a desperate, half-formed idea, sparked in his mind. David had told him stories, old legends from the indigenous people, about the Chenu, the ice demon, the starved shadow. He dismissed them as campfire tales, but now, David had spoken of rituals, of ancient ways to ward off such things, or at least slow them down. He remembered David talking about certain materials, certain symbols, things that were anathema to the creature. He needed to get inside that cabin, not just for shelter but for answers. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only shot he had. He forced himself to his feet, every muscle screaming in protest. His vision blurred, his head swam, but the burning intensity of the red eyes behind him kept him moving. He stumbled towards the faint outline, his mind racing, trying to recall every detail of David's rambling stories. What was it that repelled it? What was the starved shadow truly afraid of? As he pushed forward, the ground beneath his feet shifted unexpectedly. He hadn't seen the crevice, hidden beneath a fresh blanket of snow. His foot plunged into empty space. A sharp, searing pain shot up his leg as his ankle twisted violently. He cried out, losing his balance, and tumbled forward, rolling down a short, steep incline, coming to a jarring halt against the packed snow at the bottom. Dazed, disoriented, and now in excruciating pain, he tried to push himself up. His ankle throbbed, a white-hot agony that made him grit his teeth. He was trapped, injured, and exposed. The blizzard howled above him, a deafening roar that seemed to mock his futile struggle. And then through the swirling snow he saw it. The dark, skeletal form, silhouetted against the white, standing at the edge of the incline he had just fallen down. The red eyes were fixed on him, burning with an unwavering predatory gaze. It had followed him. It was here. And now he had nowhere left to run. The starved shadow had finally cornered its prey. The icy air bit at Michael's lungs, each ragged breath a desperate gasp for oxygen that felt thin and insufficient. Pain screamed through his left leg, a white-hot agony that radiated from his knee up to his hip, a brutal souvenir of his uncontrolled descent. He lay sprawled on the narrow ledge, the jagged rocks digging into his back, his rifle a few feet away, its stock wedged precariously between two stones. His hand instinctively reached for it, fingers trembling, but the effort sent a fresh wave of nausea through him. He couldn't move. Not really. His body was a symphony of protest, every muscle seized, every nerve ending aflame. But the pain, for all its intensity, was a distant hum compared to the paralyzing terror that gripped him. That terror had a name now, or at least an image. The two burning red eyes fixed on him from the edge of the incline. The creature didn't move. Not yet. It simply watched, those crimson pinpricks in the deepening gloom burning with an ancient, patient malevolence. It was as if it savored the moment, the finality of the chase, the absolute helplessness of its quarry. Michael felt like a deer caught in a hunter's scope, every instinct screaming to flee, but his body stubbornly refused to obey. Then slowly, deliberately, it began to descend. It didn't walk, not in any conventional sense. It flowed down the rock face, a distortion in the air, a ripple of darkness that seemed to absorb the scant moonlight. Its form was still indistinct, a vague, elongated silhouette against the snow-dusted rocks, but as it drew closer, details began to emerge. It was impossibly gaunt, skeletal, its limbs unnaturally long and thin, ending in what looked like elongated, clawed digits that seemed to melt into the rock as it moved, leaving no discernible trace. Its head, if it could be called that, was a narrow, almost featureless wedge, dominated entirely by those two hypnotic red eyes, which now pulsed with a faint internal light. No sound. Not a rustle, not a scrape, not a breath. It was pure, silent predation, an entity that defied the natural laws of sound and motion. The air around it grew colder, a chilling dead cold that seeped into Michael's bones, far beyond the ambient Alaskan chill. He could feel his teeth chattering uncontrollably, a primal, involuntary response to the extreme temperature drop. His hand twitched again, reaching for the rifle. It was just out of reach, mockingly close. He pushed, gritting his teeth, ignoring the agony in his leg. His fingers brushed against the cold metal of the barrel, just a little more. He could feel the creature's presence growing, a suffocating weight in the air, pressing down on him, stealing his breath. He finally grasped the rifle, pulling it towards him with a grunt of pain. It was heavy, reassuringly solid in his hands, but as he fumbled to bring it up, to aim, the creature stopped. It was no more than 10 feet away now, its full, terrifying form visible in the faint light. It wasn't just a shadow, it was a lack of light, a void that seemed to suck the very essence from the air. Its skin, if it had skin, was a mottled gray-black, stretched taut over a frame that seemed too fragile to support itself, yet moved with an impossible grace. And then it spoke. Not with a voice, not with words, but with something far more insidious. A low, guttural vibration, a sound that bypassed his ears entirely and resonated deep within his skull, echoing in the hollow spaces of his mind. It wasn't a growl nor a roar. It was a hunger, An ancient, bottomless, all-consuming hunger that wasn't just for flesh, but for something deeper, something vital. And with that sound, images flooded Michael's mind, unbidden, terrifyingly real. He saw Emily, her face pale with fear, her eyes wide as she stumbled through a snow-laden forest, a dark shape moving silently behind her. Then David, struggling against invisible bonds, his mouth open in a silent scream. And then Sarah, her final terrified glance at something unseen, something vast and hungry. These weren't memories. They were visions projected directly into his consciousness, the creature's own memories or perhaps its intentions. It was showing him what it had done, what it would do. A wave of profound despair washed over Michael, a feeling of utter helplessness that threatened to crush his spirit. This wasn't just a beast. It was something that could touch his mind, something that reveled in the terror and despair of its victims. The starved shadow wasn't just killing. It was consuming. But Michael was a hunter. He had faced down grizzlies, outsmarted cunning wolves, endured blizzards that would break lesser men. He might be broken, but he wasn't beaten. Not yet. The images, the despair, they fueled a different kind of fire within him. A cold, hard rage. This thing wasn't just a threat to him. It was a predator that had taken his friends, his colleagues, leaving only a trail of unanswered questions and profound sorrow. He fought through the mental assault, his grip tightening on the rifle. His fingers found the safety catch, flipping it off with a sharp click that seemed deafening in the unnatural silence. He brought the rifle up, ignoring the throbbing pain in his leg, aiming for the pulsing red eyes. "You want me?" Michael croaked, his voice raw, barely a whisper against the creature's silent roar in his mind. "Then come and get me, you son of a bitch." He fired. The roar of the rifle echoed through the ravine, a deafening explosion that momentarily shattered the oppressive stillness. The muzzle flash illuminated the creature for a split second, revealing its skeletal outline in stark, horrifying detail. The bullet tore through the space where its head had been, producing no impact, no sound of flesh or bone. It was as if the bullet passed through empty air, leaving only a shimmering distortion in its wake. The creature didn't flinch, didn't recoil. Instead, it advanced, its movements now faster, more fluid, like smoke coiling towards him. The red eyes seemed to intensify, burning brighter, and the silent scream in Michael's mind became unbearable, a cacophony of fear and hunger. He fired again and again, the rifle bucking in his hands. Each shot met with the same non-effect, the bullets passing through the creature's form as if it were a mirage. Desperation clawed at him. What was this thing? How could he fight something he couldn't hit? As the creature closed the distance, Michael could feel the intense cold radiating from it, a cold that felt unnatural, draining the warmth not just from his body, but from his very soul. He tried to reload, his fingers fumbling with the magazine, but the creature was too fast. It was on him in an instant. Not a physical tackle, not a clawed strike, but a sudden, overwhelming envelopment. The darkness of its form seemed to expand, washing over him, a suffocating blanket of absolute cold and despair. He felt no physical contact, no crushing weight, but the sensation was far worse. It was as if he was being absorbed, his very being dissolving into the void. The world around him faded, replaced by an infinite, crushing darkness. The silent scream in his mind became a chorus, 1,000 voices of the lost and the consumed, all crying out in terror and agony. He was drowning in pure, unadulterated fear. His rifle slipped from his grasp, clattering uselessly against the rocks. He thrashed, gasped, trying to fight against the unseen force, but there was nothing to hit, nothing to push against. He felt his consciousness waver, the edges of his vision blurring, the cold seeping deeper, threatening to extinguish the last spark of his life. Then a flicker, a memory sharp and clear, not from the creature but his own. Jessica. Her laugh, her fierce determination, her unwavering belief in him. It was a lifeline, a tiny ember in the overwhelming darkness. He wouldn't let this thing take him. He wouldn't become another silent scream in its endless hunger. With a surge of desperate, adrenaline-fueled will, Michael lashed out. Not with a weapon, but with his hand, blindly striking into the encroaching darkness. His fingers connected with something. Not solid, not ethereal, but something. A strange, vibrating texture, like taut, incredibly cold silk stretched over an impossibly rigid frame. And where his hand made contact, a faint, almost imperceptible shimmer of light bloomed, a tiny defiance in the encroaching gloom. The creature recoiled. It was slight, barely a ripple, but it was there. The suffocating darkness receded, and Michael gasped, dragging air back into his burning lungs. The cold lessened, the mental cacophony fading to a dull throb. He stared wide-eyed as the starved shadow pulled back a few feet, its red eyes glowing with what seemed like surprise, perhaps even a flicker of pain. And then Michael saw it. Not on the creature, but on the rock face behind it, illuminated faintly by his own inner will, or perhaps by the residual energy of the creature's recoil. A symbol, etched deep into the ancient stone, barely visible under centuries of frost and lichen. A complex design, a swirling vortex with jagged lines radiating outwards, unmistakably similar to the crude drawings in Dr. Peterson's journal, the ones he had dismissed as mere superstition. The creature's red eyes darted to the symbol, then back to Michael, a new intensity in their gaze. It wasn't just hunger now, it was something else, recognition, and a profound ancient hatred. It let out another silent scream, but this one was different, laced with frustration, with a raw primal fury. It lunged again, but this time Michael was ready. He didn't have his rifle, but his hunting knife was still sheathed at his hip. He tore it free, the cold steel a sudden, welcome weight in his hand. He didn't know what he was doing, what he could possibly hope to achieve, but he had seen the symbol, and he had seen the creature's reaction. There was a connection, a weakness. As the starved shadow rushed him, a whirlwind of shadow and impossible cold, Michael didn't aim for the eyes. He aimed for the space between, the vague, shifting center of its form, and with a desperate, guttural yell, he plunged the blade forward. He felt it connect, not with flesh, but with that same vibrating, cold silk texture, and this time there was more than a shimmer. A ripple of dark energy exploded outwards, and the creature let out a sound that was truly terrifying. A high-pitched, inhuman shriek that scraped against the very fabric of reality. It recoiled violently, a sudden convulsive spasm that sent it hurtling backwards, up the incline. The darkness around it seemed to waver, its form momentarily solidifying into something like a withered, desiccated corpse, before dissolving back into a swirling vortex of shadow. It paused at the top of the incline, its red eyes burning with an incandescent rage, fixed on Michael, on the knife still clutched in his trembling hand. It understood. He had found something, a vulnerability. The creature didn't attack again. Not directly. Instead, it pulled back, melting into the deeper shadows of the surrounding forest, its red eyes the last thing to vanish. The oppressive cold began to recede, the air gradually warming, the silent screams in Michael's mind fading to an echo. He was alone again, left with the throbbing pain in his leg, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth, and the horrifying realization that he had just touched something ancient, something that defied all understanding. He was still cornered, still injured, but now he had a weapon, not just a knife but knowledge. He had glimpsed a weakness, a truth hidden in plain sight. The starved shadow had retreated, but it hadn't given up. It was out there watching, waiting. And now Michael knew why it was truly starved. Not just for flesh, but for something it had lost, something that symbol represented. And he was standing right in the middle of it. Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the biting Alaskan wind. The symbol, carved deep into the ancient spruce, wasn't just a marker. It was a declaration, a lament, a scar. He wasn't dealing with a mere animal, no matter how formidable. This was something else entirely, something with a history, a purpose, and a pain so profound it warped its very existence. The creature was starved, yes, but not just for flesh. It was starved for what that symbol represented, for something it had lost, something that had been taken. And Michael, in his unwitting pursuit, had stumbled into the very heart of its ancient grievance. He looked from the symbol to the cabin, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the unforgiving wilderness. The trapper who had lived here, the one whose life had been cut short, must have known something. Perhaps he had carved the symbol himself, or had seen it, understood its meaning, and paid the ultimate price. A desperate hope flickered within Michael. If there was an answer, it had to be inside that cabin. Pushing through the heavy, snow-crusted door, Michael stepped into a world frozen in time. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, old wood, and a faint metallic tang he couldn't quite place. Dust motes danced in the slivers of weak light piercing through grimy window panes. A table stood overturned, a chair splintered. It wasn't just abandoned, it had been ransacked. Not by a human, Michael realized, but by something immensely powerful, something that wasn't looking for valuables but for something else entirely. Something that perhaps the trapper had possessed. His eyes scanned the chaos, his senses on high alert. Every creak of the old timbers, every gust of wind rattling the loose panes, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He moved cautiously, his rifle held ready, scanning the shadowy corners. On a rickety shelf, half buried under a pile of mildewed blankets and overturned tins, he spotted it. A leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth, its pages swollen with moisture. He snatched it up, his fingers trembling slightly. The binding was fragile, threatening to crumble in his hands. He found a relatively untouched corner, a small built-in bunk, and sat down, carefully opening the journal. The handwriting was cramped, precise, almost elegant despite the rough conditions. The first few entries dated back years, detailing the mundane life of a solitary trapper named Silas. Trapping routes, weather observations, the price of furs. Then the tone began to shift. October 14th. Saw a set of tracks today, unlike any I've ever seen. Too large for a wolf, too narrow for a bear. Almost human-like in their stride, but with claws that could tear a man in half. Michael's breath hitched. This was it. Silas had seen it too. November 3rd. Heard it again. A low moan carried on the wind. Not an animal in distress, but something deeper, more sorrowful. Sounds intelligent. It sounds like grief. Grief. The word echoed Michael's own dawning realization. He flipped pages, his heart pounding in his chest. The entries became more frequent, more frantic. December 1st. It watches me. From the tree line. I've caught glimpses. It moves too fast. Too silent. Its eyes are like burning embers in the dark. It's not just hunting. It's observing. Outside the cabin, a low thud vibrated through the floorboards. Michael froze, his head snapping up. He listened, straining his ears against the wind. Nothing. Just the howl of the wind. He told himself it was just the cabin settling, but his grip on the journal tightened. He returned to Silas's words, desperate for answers. January 12th found the symbol, carved into the ancient spruce near the old burial ground. The one the old one spoke of, the place where the earth remembers. It's the same mark I saw scratched into the rocks near the fall seasons ago. It's a warning. Or a claim. A burial ground. Michael's mind raced. An ancient site. The creature watching it. Was it guarding something? Or was it part of it? February 5th. It wants something. It's not just bloodlust. I've seen it leave kills untouched but tear apart the traps. It's methodical. It's angry. It's trying to tell me something. And I think it's connected to the old stories. The ones about the guardians of the lost path. Guardians of the lost path. Michael felt a jolt of recognition, a chilling resonance with the symbol. This wasn't some random beast. It was a sentinel, a protector. But what was it protecting? And what path had been lost? March 1st. I've been researching the old legends. The ones the native elders whispered about, before they were silenced. They spoke of a time when the spirits of the land walked among men, when a sacred pact was made to protect the heart of the wild. A pact broken by the greedy, by those who took without giving. And when the pact was broken, the guardian awoke. Not as a beast, but as an embodiment of the land's sorrow and its rage. Seeks to reclaim. It seeks justice. Michael's blood ran cold. Justice. Not just survival. Not just hunger. The creature wasn't attacking out of simple predatory instinct. It was acting with purpose, with a deeper, almost moral imperative. It was a force of nature, yes, but one imbued with a history of profound injustice. It was protecting something ancient, something violated, and it saw Michael, a hunter, a human, as another threat, another trespasser. A violent thud shook the entire cabin, rattling the windows in their frames. This was no settling timber. This was a deliberate impact. The creature was outside, and it knew Michael was inside. A low guttural growl vibrated through the walls, a sound of immense power and simmering fury. Michael scrambled to his feet, clutching the journal. Silas's words still burned in his mind. It seeks to reclaim. It seeks justice. This wasn't a hunt anymore. This was a reckoning. The symbol wasn't just a mark. It was a testament to a broken promise, a desecrated land, and a forgotten guardian now unleashed. The creature's silhouette appeared in the grimy window, a fleeting shadow against the snow-laden twilight. His eyes, Michael imagined, would be burning. It wasn't just observing now. It was pressing its attack. It was demanding payment. Another bone-jarring impact struck the door, splintering the old wood around the frame. The cabin, once a refuge, was now a flimsy cage. Michael was trapped, armed with a rifle and a terrifying truth. He understood now, but understanding didn't make him safe. It only made him realize the true horrifying scale of the ancient primal force he had inadvertently provoked. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but the hunter was not just a beast. It was the embodiment of the Alaskan wilderness's oldest, most painful secret, and Michael was standing directly in the path of its long-awaited vengeance. He had to escape, but more importantly, he had to figure out what Silas had meant by reclaim, and if there was any way to appease a guardian driven by centuries of grief and rage. The next move would decide everything. The next move would decide everything. Michael, adrenaline coursing through his veins despite the throbbing agony in his leg, knew he couldn't stay put. Silas, wounded but still a formidable, almost supernatural presence, would be on him in moments. He pushed himself off the ground, a grunt escaping his lips as his injured leg buckled, sending a white-hot spear of pain through his thigh. He had to keep moving, to think, to understand. He scrambled deeper into the gnarled embrace of the ancient forest, ignoring the sharp branches that clawed at his face and clothes. Each step was a battle against his own failing body, his breath ragged, his vision blurring at the edges. He wasn't just running from a man. He was running from an ancient force, a vengeful spirit channeled through human flesh. The sheer terror of that realization was a cold, sharp knife twisting in his gut. He tried to think, desperately sifting through every word Silas had uttered, every strange occurrence, every unsettling feeling he'd had since arriving in this cursed stretch of wilderness. Reclaim. What did it mean? What was Silas trying to reclaim? And how could he, Michael, a simple hunter, be caught in the middle of a centuries-old vendetta? He moved with the instinct of a hunted animal, using the dense thicket to his advantage, doubling back, trying to mask his trail in the shallow creeks and over rocky outcrops. He was a master tracker, but Silas was something else entirely. It wasn't just tracking. It was an innate sense of direction, an unnerving intuition that seemed to anticipate Michael's every desperate maneuver. He could feel Silas's presence, a cold shadow dogging his every step, not far behind. The air grew heavy, thick with a damp chill that seeped into his bones. The forest, once a source of comfort and challenge, now felt oppressive, alive with unseen eyes. The trees themselves seemed to lean in, their ancient branches like skeletal fingers pointing the way for his pursuer. He stumbled, falling hard, his rifle clattering against a rock. Panic flared, but he forced it down, retrieving the weapon. It was almost useless against Silas, but it was a familiar weight, a sliver of hope. He crawled through a thorny patch, emerging into a small, almost perfectly circular clearing. It was unlike anything he had seen in the Alaskan wilderness before. Towering, impossibly old cedars formed a natural cathedral, their branches intertwined overhead, blocking out the sky. In the center stood a ring of jagged, moss-covered stones, some standing upright like ancient sentinels, others toppled and partially buried. And in the very heart of the ring, a single gnarled tree, its bark scarred and twisted, seemed to pulse with a faint, almost imperceptible light. Michael felt an inexplicable pull towards it, a strange mix of fear and reverence. He limped closer, his eyes scanning the ancient stones. His heart pounded, not just from exertion, but from the chilling realization that he had stumbled upon something sacred, something profoundly ancient. He ran a trembling hand over one of the standing stones. His fingers found faint, deeply etched carvings beneath layers of lichen and moss. He traced the lines, his mind struggling to interpret the unfamiliar symbols. They weren't animal tracks or hunting signs. These were stylized figures, abstract patterns, and what looked like a narrative told in stone. He saw depictions of a people, unlike any he knew, living in harmony with the land. He saw a stylized sun and moon, animals of the forest, and then a change. The carvings shifted, depicting the arrival of outsiders. Figures with different clothing, strange tools. There was a struggle, chaos, and then a central image. A small, intricately carved wooden figure, almost identical to the totem he had found in the old cabin, being taken away by one of the foreign figures. A sense of dread washed over him, turning his blood to ice. He remembered the totem, the one he had picked up out of curiosity, the one he still carried in his pack. The carvings continued, showing the land weeping, the animals suffering, and the original people fading, their spirits intertwining with the very trees and stones. And then a new figure emerged from the depths of the earth, a shadowy, powerful entity, its form indistinct but radiating immense power and sorrow. This figure, the Guardian, stood watch over the desecrated land, its eyes fixed on the path the outsiders had taken. It was an image of perpetual vigilance, of an eternal promise of vengeance. A cold, undeniable truth settled in Michael's bones. This was it. This was the history, the centuries of grief and rage that Silas had spoken of. This was the origin of the Guardian. And the totem, the small, seemingly innocuous artifact he had picked up, was the very object at the heart of this ancient tragedy. He wasn't just a trespasser. He was an unwitting carrier of the stolen legacy, a symbol of the intrusion that had plagued this land for centuries. Silas wasn't just a deranged murderer. He was a vessel, a manifestation of the land's will, a spirit of vengeance given flesh, driven by the collective memory of a wronged people. He was the Guardian come to reclaim what was lost, to right an ancient wrong. And Michael, the hunter who had ventured too deep, who had unknowingly disturbed the balance by carrying the stolen totem, was now the target of that ancient fury. Reclaim! The word echoed in his mind. No longer a mystery but a terrifying clarity. Silas wanted the totem back. And if Michael wouldn't give it or couldn't, or if Silas simply saw him as another in a long line of desecrators, then Michael's life was forfeit. He was not just being hunted. He was being judged by a force older than time. A force that saw him as part of the very problem it was sworn to eradicate. A twig snapped behind him. Michael spun around, his rifle raised, his breath catching in his throat. Silas stood at the edge of the clearing, his face a mask of grim determination, his eyes burning with an ancient fire. He was no longer just a man. He was the embodiment of the forest's rage, a living monument to forgotten sorrow. "It is time." Silas's voice was a low growl, resonating with the very thrum of the earth, to reclaim what was taken. His gaze fell upon Michael's pack, a silent, knowing accusation. Michael knew then that there was no escape, not in the traditional sense. He could run, but Silas would always find him. He could fight, but what could a man do against a spirit that had endured for centuries? He was trapped, not by a physical barrier, but by the weight of history, by a destiny he had unknowingly stumbled into. His only chance, his only hope was to understand, to somehow appease this ancient rage. But how? How could he, a single man, atone for centuries of desecration? How could he return what was taken, when the act of taking was so deeply woven into the land's very fabric? The answer felt impossibly far away, shrouded in the deepening shadows of the ancient forest, as Silas began to advance, his silhouette merging with the primal darkness. Michael gripped his rifle tighter, his mind racing, knowing that his final moments in this cursed wilderness would depend entirely on what he did next. Michael gripped his rifle tighter, his mind racing, knowing that his final moments in this cursed wilderness would depend entirely on what he did next. Silas moved with a predatory grace, not rushing, but a relentless, measured pace that spoke of absolute certainty. He was no longer just a man in tattered furs. He was the embodiment of the forest's ancient wrath, a shadow given form and purpose. Michael could feel it in the chilling air, in the unnatural silence that had descended upon the clearing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, seemed to amplify the terrifying presence of his pursuer. Michael knew he couldn't outrun him, not in this state, not against this. He had to stand his ground, but how do you fight a force of nature? His rifle felt heavy, yet useless, against a being that seemed to defy the very laws of the natural world. He remembered the phantom footsteps, the impossible appearances, the way Silas seemed to melt into the trees. This wasn't a man he was hunting or being hunted by. This was something else entirely. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the vast, indifferent expanse of the Alaskan wild. He raised his rifle, the cold steel a small comfort against the encroaching dread. His finger hovered over the trigger, but a strange hesitation held him back. What if a bullet wasn't enough? What if it only angered him further? Silas continued his slow advance, a spectral figure emerging from the gloom. His eyes, even from this distance, seemed to burn with an ancient, knowing fire. There was no rage, no bloodlust that Michael could discern, only a profound, chilling resolve. It was the look of a judge, not an executioner. Michael took a shaky breath, trying to clear his mind. He scanned the clearing, searching for an escape route, a vantage point, anything. But the forest was a labyrinth, and he was cornered. He remembered the stories, the old prospectors who vanished, the whisper of the land claiming its own. Silas wasn't just a madman. He was the wilderness's chosen instrument. Then a thought, cold and sharp as an ice shard, pierced through his terror. Silas hadn't just been hunting him. He had been testing him, guiding him almost. From the rigged traps to the cryptic warnings, to the very path Michael had unknowingly followed. Silas had been forcing him to confront something deep within himself, and within the land. He wasn't trying to kill Michael outright. He was trying to break him, to make him understand. Understand what? The sanctity of the wild? The folly of greed? Michael looked down at the small pouch of gold dust still clutched in his pocket, a stark reminder of the fever that had driven him here, to this desolate, beautiful, and terrifying place. It was the very thing that had lured him into Silas's domain. He lowered his rifle slowly, deliberately. Silas paused, his advance faltering for the first time. His head tilted slightly, observing Michael's unexpected move. "You want the gold, don't you?" Michael's voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible in the profound silence. "That's what this is about. All of it." Silas remained motionless, a statue carved from shadow and ancient wood. He offered no reply, only that unwavering, judging gaze. Michael reached into his pocket and pulled out the small leather pouch. It felt heavy, not just with the weight of the gold, but with the weight of his ambition, his disregard for the warnings, his hubris. He stared at it, the glimmer of the flakes catching the faint light filtering through the trees. It had cost him everything. His peace, his sanity, almost his life. "It's not worth it," Michael said, his voice gaining a strange strength, a clarity born of absolute terror and profound realization. "None of it is worth what this place demands." He opened the pouch and, with a shuddering breath, poured the glittering dust onto the forest floor. The gold, once his obsession, now seemed insignificant, trivial, a curse. It vanished into the moss and decaying leaves, swallowed by the very earth it had been torn from. Silas watched, his gaze fixed on the disappearing gold. Then slowly, his eyes lifted back to Michael. There was a subtle shift in his posture, a slight softening around the edges of his rigid form, or perhaps it was just the trick of the failing light. Michael couldn't be sure. He then unslung his rifle, the weapon that had represented his control, his power over the wild. He laid it carefully on the ground, not throwing it in defiance, but placing it down as an act of surrender, of respect. He was disarming himself, not just physically but spiritually. He was no longer the hunter. He was merely a man lost and humbled. "I understand," Michael whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I understand now." Silas held his gaze for another long, agonizing moment. The air crackled with unspoken meaning, with the ancient pacts between man and nature. Then, without a sound, without a single rustle of leaves, Silas turned. He didn't run, he didn't stalk away. He simply dissolved into the deepening shadows of the forest, becoming one with the primal darkness from which he had emerged. One moment he was there, a terrifying sentinel, the next he was gone, leaving only the profound, echoing silence in his wake. Michael stood frozen, his heart still pounding, but now mixed with a strange, unsettling calm. He was alive. He had faced the impossible and survived. But he was not the same man. The encounter had stripped him bare, revealing the raw, vulnerable core beneath his veneer of adventure and ambition. He didn't look back at the spot where Silas had vanished. He didn't retrieve his rifle. He simply turned and began to walk, his steps faltering at first, then gaining a desperate urgency. He walked for what felt like an eternity, through the deepening twilight, through the silent, watchful trees. Every shadow seemed to hold Silas's form, every creak of a branch a phantom footstep. He pushed himself, fueled by an instinct to escape, to reach the edges of this cursed, magnificent wilderness. Days blurred into a haze of exhaustion, hunger, and an ever-present sense of dread. He navigated by instinct, following the faint memory of the river, pushing towards the distant promise of civilization. He ate what he could find, berries and roots, his body aching, his mind a whirlwind of fragmented images. Silas's eyes, the burning cabin, the glittering gold sinking into the earth. Finally, after what felt like an endless nightmare, he saw it. A faint wisp of smoke curling against the distant horizon, a sign of human life. He stumbled towards it, his legs giving out beneath him several times, but an indomitable will pushed him forward. He emerged from the tree line, a gaunt, disheveled figure, onto a gravel road. A small, dilapidated cabin stood nearby, its porch light a beacon in the encroaching gloom. He collapsed onto the dirt, the sheer relief washing over him, stealing the last vestiges of his strength. The elderly couple who found him, pioneers weathered by years in the Alaskan interior, were shocked by his appearance. They nursed him back to health, asking few questions, their eyes holding the knowing silence of those who understood the wilderness's power. Michael offered only fragmented answers, speaking of a lost trail, a fall, a struggle. He couldn't speak of Silas, not fully. How could he explain what he had seen, what he had felt? They would never believe him. Perhaps he thought they already knew. He eventually made his way out of Alaska, leaving behind not just the gold, but a piece of himself. The ambition, the reckless pursuit of wealth, had been purged by the wilderness. He returned to the lower 48, a ghost of his former self, haunted by the memory of the ancient forest and its silent, terrifying guardian. Michael never spoke of Silas again, not truly. The experience had changed him irrevocably. He found work far from the wild, in a quiet, unassuming town, living a simple life devoid of grand adventures or dangerous pursuits. He never looked at a forest the same way again, seeing not just trees and earth, but a living, breathing entity, ancient and powerful, with its own protectors and its own justice. Sometimes, in the dead of night, he would wake in a cold sweat, the image of Silas's eyes burned into his memory. He would see the silhouette merging with the primal darkness, hear the whisper of the wind carrying an ancient warning. He knew that the Alaskan wilderness held secrets far deeper than any gold vein, mysteries that defied human understanding. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that some hunters were not just men, and some territories were not meant to be conquered. The hunter had indeed become the hunted, but in the end, Michael had learned that the greatest prey was not gold, but the very soul of the land itself. And the price of that pursuit was a transformation more profound, and more terrifying, than any treasure could ever offer. He had escaped with his life, but a part of him would forever remain in the silent, watchful embrace of the Alaskan wild, forever marked by the enigmatic guardian known only as Silas. The mountains still stood, the river still flowed, and somewhere, deep within the untamed heart of the north, the ancient protector still watched, ensuring that the balance was kept, and that the hunter, no matter how cunning, would always remember the true nature of the wild.